the Via Stoica Podcast with Brendan and Benny. Powered by viastoica.com, your home for coaching, workshops, quotes, and Stoic content that inspires.
Hello. Welcome to the Via Stoica Podcast. I'm your co-host, Brendan Hogel, and I'm here with my good friend, Benny Vunken. What's going on, buddy? How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm still in the van. For those who are watching this episode on YouTube, you can see like the surroundings of the van. I'm still on my way. This is like how I live and travel. And how are you doing, Brendan? Hopefully not suffering there in life.
Yeah, I'm here in Panama. We got a little bit of suffering going on. It's been rainy season for the past few months, and we are getting to the very end of rainy season, and that is traditionally the time where it is the absolute worst. So for the last 6 days, it has just been raining pretty much nonstop. So yeah, it's been a little bit of suffering, but hey, I get to use that time wisely to do other things, some indoor activities. But that's what we're going to be discussing today is suffering and how the Stoics view that. There is some things, just to kind of kick it off, that I first think about when I think about this subject. There is this idea that we should, as Stoics, kind of put ourselves in situations that are a bit difficult, voluntary discomforts, as it's referred to often. But what is that extent, right? And that's what I want to kind of talk about today is how far do we take that? There's got to be a point where you put yourself into suffering that is too much and overdoing it, right? Because, we do have, yes, we kind of want to harden, we want to build resistance and grit to difficult situations, but we don't want to also put ourselves through a ton of unnecessary suffering and unnecessary difficulties. So I live here in Panama, right? And rain is something that we have to deal with. Living in a damp environment like this, things mold and life is just difficult sometimes. But I choose to do that. That's an exchange that I make because I want to live in this country and I love living here. So for a few months of the year, I have to deal with something that's not so great. I imagine the same idea for people who live in the north in the US, right? It gets very cold there during the winter and those are difficult months, but those summers are amazing. So Benny, what do you think about, when you think about suffering and how we should view it? Do you view it as a positive maybe or a tool, or how do you look at suffering personally?
Yeah, and good, good examples there. And I've had the fortune to experience that life in Panama there a little bit with you guys. That was amazing. That was definitely not suffering. And although sometimes when the electricity went out, it was adjusting. So maybe that's a nice kind of segue that we have the tools to deal with suffering. And you mentioned voluntary discomfort, right? And there is a distinction between discomfort and suffering. So discomfort is something where you are just not comfortable, right? Just some smaller things that can be changed. But suffering is something prolonged and something that really, and then we're talking maybe not even about physical suffering, although that's part of it as well, but more internal suffering, like mental suffering and having those things that where life really treats you bad. So I think that's a distinction to make because the Stoics do practice the involuntary discomfort, which means like eating stale bread in their case, right, back in the Roman days, or sleeping on the floor. Those things, like I'm here in the van and I fall down the table and I sleep on these things. For me, that's not even discomfort. I can just lay down wherever I have to. So maybe I've practiced it a little bit too much in my life. But when we talk about suffering, I like to refer to Viktor Frankl in his book, Man's Search for Meaning, where he talks about the difference between voluntary suffering and involuntary suffering. If you haven't read that book, definitely check it out because it's a great one. He's talking about how he survived the concentration camps in Nazi Germany during the Second World War. And he makes that clear distinction, right? Voluntary suffering is needless, right? That's something that you really do to yourself. But involuntary suffering is very valuable because that fate is giving you these moments to practice and to really grow as a person. And that's what we need. We need that involuntary suffering, right, to test ourselves. And the Stoics would even take it a little bit further. They would welcome it. They wouldn't apply it to themselves, but they wouldn't just put themselves through it. But when the fates hands them that card, they would welcome it and say, okay, this is my suffering that I need to use to see if I'm actually practicing the things that I preach, to see if I'm actually doing the things that I'm learning and studying about. So they welcome that kind of test. They see it as a test. And for me, paradoxically, then it doesn't, it kind of changes from suffering into a learning moment, into something more positive. So in a way, that suffering kind of goes away from that approach. So that is kind of interesting. But that's my take with suffering. We do all have our problems. We all do suffer in ways, some people to a greater extent, or maybe it's also because we look at it from the outside view, right? We see people suffering and we think, we project ourselves on that situation and say, I don't know if I could deal with that. Oh, that would be so hard for me. I couldn't deal with that. But people do deal with things, and we can deal with more than we think. So that's my first take of suffering, that difference between involuntary suffering, voluntary suffering, and the voluntary discomfort that we talked about.
No, those are really great points, Benny. I appreciate you bringing those up. And then, kind of what you mentioned there about the kind of the time, right? So if it's prolonged, that's a little bit different than maybe just a short-term thing of, there's many mentions. I can't remember exactly who said it, but kind of one of the Stoics talks about, every once in a while, like, yes, you have a comfy bed, but, maybe one night you sleep on the floor, just to kind of like experience that for a little bit. So that makes sense to me. And I really like activities like that. I think doing little small things like that just kind of adds a little bit more grit to your kind of reserve, right? That you can lean on next time. But I do want to ask a little bit a question of what you think about this is as far as like the prolonged suffering, right? And sometimes, you have those experiences and situations where they are under our control, right? So say, for example, like I decide I'm going to go do a very difficult physical activity, right? I'm going to climb a really high mountain, or I'm going to do something like that. That is totally within my control, right? But then there's other forms of suffering that I've experienced, like suffering in a terrible job, right? Like I had a job that I did not like. Now I couldn't control the reasons I didn't like it. It was someone else. It was my boss. It was, colleagues and things like that. I couldn't control that. But I also at one point was sitting there and trying to kind of decide, like, how long do I want to be in this moment? Because there is a point to this, right? Like the idea is I have this job and yeah, maybe it's terrible, but the goal is it's bringing me to something else, right? Maybe I then work really hard here and I can move up the ladder, so to speak, and get to the next job, which is actually what I want. So how do you look at that, kind of approach of how long do you sit with something that is, is maybe not the ideal situation for you, but could be a stepping stone to the next, accepting that there's some suffering that goes along with that progress.
Yeah, that's those are great points, right? And good questions. And I think there's a difference between the suffering that you mentioned, right? First of all, the athlete that puts himself or herself through some gruesome tasks or endurances, and there's always that moment to stop. And we can also, a lot of those experiences they share, that it's all mental, right? It's all in our heads, how much of it we can take. And some people are just more prone to deal with suffering, or at least they have that drive to put themselves through that test. As you described, that person sitting in a job, I think in a lot of those moments, we forget that we have the choice to do something different. And we only reach that moment once we reach that ultimate peak of suffering where we just I can't take it anymore. So when we are stuck in some kind of situation, right? And again, we can read that in Viktor Frankl's book. And when we don't, and Viktor Frankl talked about that suffering in the concentration camps, which is, not even comparable to a job or to an exercise. But he talked about this in a sense, the people that survived, they had a sense of purpose, right? The people who survived, they had a sense of meaning in their lives, and they gave that to themselves. So for example, the athlete who is looking to run a marathon, right? And he has a sense of purpose. This is something that is an internal drive for this person, that they want to go and do this, right? The person who sits in a job might not feel that suffering because they have a purpose to do. They might want to pay their mortgage, right? They want to support their families. And when it becomes suffering, in my opinion at least, is when we start to work for things that we don't really need. When we start to work for those excesses, and then we start to suffer because we don't come home and find that value that we find in supporting the family or the loved ones that we have. But we are driving a car back home that doesn't give us that pleasure, that value, that sense of self that we need when we are doing something for really the right purposes, right? And that's where the Stoics make that divide between the needs and wants, right? First, make sure you have your basic needs met, and then make sure you have enough. But we go far beyond that. So that's why we can't see the choice that we have when we are suffering. And the Stoics say we always have a choice, right? In Epictetus or Seneca, there's that line that says you can always turn the dagger the other way around, right? Now, we don't want to advocate for suicide or self-harm here, but the Stoics say that there's always a choice and there's always a way out there. So if you're stuck in a job and you are suffering in that job, think about the other options you have. Maybe leaving that job might not be the worst outcome of your situation. What do you think about that, and how do you see that prolonged suffering?
I know those are great points, Benny. And like, as you were talking, the thing that kind of like clicked for me was that, if you're suffering, to me, that's almost a lack of purpose, right? Because if I'm in a job that I don't like, and ultimately what happened for me in that job that I was in, that I was suffering in, I decided eventually, I'm like, I'm not learning anything more here. I'm not progressing anymore. So I'm going to leave this job and start my own thing and get out of here. So there was something there where I was lacking like a purpose. I was lacking like a kind of, I'm going through this suffering for almost no reason. So why do it? Whereas there's other aspects in my life and other challenges that I've had to deal with in my life that, it was suffering. It is suffering, but like there's a light at the end of the tunnel, so to speak. I can see the value in the suffering and say, look, yes, this is very difficult to deal with. This is very difficult to navigate, but I know that once I get through this, on the other side of it, I will have learned something, grown in some way, helped someone in some way, done something positive. So I think that's a really good point. What you mentioned is keeping that at the forefront, because I know for myself personally, like whenever I've felt the most, defeated or just worn out, just beaten down, like it usually comes in those moments where I'm kind of like, what am I doing this for? What is the purpose here? What is the why? And that is like one of the things, like the powerful things I think about Stoicism and what it does bring is why you're doing something becomes more of the focus, not what I'm supposed to do or what society expects me to do, but like what is important to me. And then how do I want to live that life in society, and how am I going to move forward doing that, and why I do stuff is so important. But for me, yeah, I mean, I do think that there is, I think I tend to put myself in suffering a lot longer than I should be. I know that about myself because I feel like that's like where the grit is born. I'm a big fan of grit. Like grit is something that I think is a trait that I have, and I think it is the reason why I have been able to achieve various accomplishments throughout my life, is because of this kind of unrelenting grit that I have. But I also think about this is a story from my past that I'll share. But there was one time where I was on the beach with my family, and my little cousins were there, and we were flying kites. And one of the kites broke and it started flying away. And my little cousin was like crying, and she was so upset. And I was like, I'm going to go get it. And I start running after the kite. And I'm thinking, well, I'll only have to run down the beach, maybe 50 yards or something, and it'll fall and I'll go get it. No. The thing kept going and going and going. And I ended up just running and running and running and running. I finally did get to it, and I picked it up and I started walking back. But after all that running, I was just so dead. I was like barely strolling back. And so by the time I got back to my family where everyone was on the beach, they were ready to leave. They packed up everything and they were walking off the beach like, hey, you missed it. You were gone for the last hour. What were you doing? So I missed out on this family experience because I was like, oh, I have to go suffer over here and like get this thing. Now, the why might have been a good reason, right? I was trying to like do something nice for my little cousin. But in the long run, I missed out on, kind of family time, a little family experience, because I decided to go suffer somewhere else. So, I mean, there's no perfect answer for me. I think it is all about this trial and error process of life that we are on every day. But having that check-in with yourself, and that's why I think the pause is so important, this idea that we talk about with, pausing in the moment, reflecting on what's going on, not getting lost in the routine and repetition of your life. But I think that pause and saying like, hey, recognizing that something is difficult, recognizing and being honest with yourself that maybe, what, I don't like this job. I'm not really happy in this relationship right now. I'm not really feeling great about this friendship. It might be a little suffering, but there's always an amount that we can take, that we are able to get through. And then there's a point where we're not. And that's for you to decide as an individual. But I think that constant checking in of like, how am I feeling about this right now? And is my why still here, still involved? Because when I first started that terrible job, I was learning a lot. Even though it was terrible, I was learning a lot. And so I stayed there. But once I stopped learning, I left. So I think that to me is what a cutoff. And that's a really good point, Benny, what you were saying about understanding kind of the purpose behind it. Because if it's just suffering for suffering, what are you doing?
And that kind of adds into the complaining factor of people who are suffering, right? If you are suffering really bad, and you have, you don't have time really to complain. You're just focused on dealing with the struggle at hand. But a lot of people, they kind of suffer and they complain about this stuff. And that's what the Stoics say. And that's one of the reasons why I do like the Stoics. And that one of those verbal slaps in the face that I needed was stop complaining. Do something about it. Make sure that you change, take action, right? You talked about grit, but there's also, we have the choice to action. We have that choice to make sure that we make some changes in our lives, even if it's just perception of how we look at things. And that's where we have that reason and logic, where we look at a situation. We can use cognitive distancing, where we remove ourselves from that situation and look at it differently. Say, why do I feel like I'm suffering? And that's where we come with that why. We're like, what is my purpose behind this? Why am I doing? Is it needless? Can I change? Can I remove myself from this? Or is this something that I need to undergo and find that lesson, that learning, right? For example, if a relationship, as I experienced, the relationship ends, there's not a lot of choices you can make to get out of that suffering, but there are choices you can make to change your focus, your attention to something else and deal with it in the right time, because it is something that at one point you're going to have to deal with. So we can find ways to deal with it. And that's where, as we start wrapping this up, it's that practice of how do we stop the suffering? Because at one point, the suffering will end. And the great thing, the Stoics talk about this as well in another text. If something hurts so bad, we numb ourselves for that, right? We have an internal protection mechanism. If you have pain that is so horribly bad, you will get numbed, right? You will just either faint or whatever. I hurt my knee very bad and it just swelled up immediately. So the nerves, they just kind of stop sending pain to your mind so you can deal with it. But if it's prolonged, then you start to get used to it, right? That might be a dangerous thing, because that might mean that you're not really dealing with it in the right way. But it would also give you the time to kind of ebb away, to take that sting out of it. And once you start to then deal with it, then you can really find ways to get over it and to process it and to get beyond it and to take the lessons out of it. So that's part of the suffering, where it can be very intense, very sharp in the moment. And then you have to, like, when my relationship ended, I started drinking for a little bit. And after that, it's like, no, this is not what I should be doing. And then you get into that prolonged suffering where you can start to deal with it gradually on your own pace and find your own tools and the things that you need. And sometimes some rules are easy, are nice to have. But that's, for me, is the nice thing about Stoicism. It shows you the why. It gives you that reason and logic to reflect on it, to see what's really happening. What do you think about like that suffering, and when that should end, and if we should really apply that kind of a break, right? Instead of keeping ruminating about things, sometimes just say, no, my thoughts are just my thoughts. I just accept them and let's just let them go and keep moving forward.
Oh yeah, no, I love that what you brought up about complaining, right? I love the line from Marcus where he's like, don't let anyone hear you complaining, not even yourself. Like, don't complain to yourself, because, and I think that goes back to the fact that we do have a choice, right? Like, even when I'm in a job that I'm suffering in, or a relationship or a friendship or whatever that I'm suffering in, I have a choice to leave whenever I want. Quit the job at that moment and walk out the door and never see that place again. So I'm not going to sit there and complain. I'm going to do something about it, right? Stoicism is a philosophy of action. So I think that is really important. I think the not complaining, because to me, why you shouldn't complain is because there's no positive outcome for it. Complaining is just kind of, to me, is like repeating the same thing over and over again. You can say it once, right? Saying it once is you trying to reflect and maybe learn and glean a little bit, a lesson from an experience, which I think is fine. So going through what happened and maybe being a little upset about it is okay. But it's when you choose to do it for so long, like that prolonged thing, that it becomes just complaining for complaining's sake. And there's not a positive action coming out of it. I think a lot about the letter that Seneca wrote where he's talking about grief, right? When someone dies, that's a very difficult thing to deal with. You are going to suffer when a loved one dies, and that's part of it. But we also have a role in that of there's an allowable amount of grief, right? Like there's maybe not allowable is not the right word, but there is an amount of grief that is rational and understandable. But there's also an amount where you can exceed it for a long time. You can be grieving someone for years or decades, and that is excessive, and you're doing yourself a disservice. And I think what you spoke about before, Benny, which was like this kind of idea of almost getting in a routine of suffering, I think that is people who are lacking the kind of pause thing that we're talking about, right? Like you still want to pause and reflect, and how do I feel day to day? Check in with yourself, check in with your heart. Where are you feeling today? Where's your energy at today? Because that tells you, are you suffering? Are you growing? Are you flourishing? Are you shrinking? What's going on here? So I think that when it comes down to it, is just our goal with philosophy is try to know ourselves a little better. And the only way you can do that is if you talk to yourself a little bit and check in with yourself and see how you're doing. So I think as long as you keep up that practice on a regular basis, that that will help to kind of combat against this excessive suffering that can happen if you let it become a routine, or you let it become a part of your life, and without realizing kind of the reasons for the suffering, the reasons for the experience that you're going through. But yeah, I mean, if you have any more thing else you want to add, Vinny, I think that this is a pretty good little talk about suffering. But if the listeners, if you have anything that you're suffering with and you want to speak to someone about it, please go to viastoica.com. We offer free consultations. You can speak with any of us about what's going on in your life, the issues that you're dealing with, and we can help you navigate those. But Vinny, this is a wonderful conversation. I really appreciate your time today. And any last words for the listeners?
Oh, that was good. Let's get them out of their suffering. No, yeah, just find your own tools. Journaling, meditation, whatever works for you. Try to find those things. Get on that exploration, what works for you. And as Brennan said, really get to know yourself through the suffering. A great episode, and hopefully we'll see you next time. Make sure to subscribe and leave a rating. So thank you very much. Thank you for listening to the Via Stoica Podcast. If you have enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing, rating, and leaving a review. Your feedback will help us reach more like-minded people on the journey to self-improvement. If you want to get in touch with us or find more information, you can go to viastoica.com, your one-stop platform for all things Stoicism and living better. And remember, virtue is the only good.